Thank you for teaching our Hevruta this week. This week's Torah portion has lots of gems for us to mine to bring to our fourth graders to facilitate conversation. We're on pages 66 to 69 of the Our Hevruta booklet. And this week's Torah portion is VaYikra. VaYikra is the very first Torah portion in the book of Leviticus. Now, Leviticus is interesting because some say that it's actually a priest's manual, that it was never meant for our eyes to see because it describes all of the sacrifices of animals and the workings of the tabernacle and the temple, the roles of the priests. And so in many ways, we're reading the holy document that instructs the priests on how to create sacred space. Now, in VaYikra, since there's so much about sacrifice, it's interesting to think about what sacrifice means. Sacrifice is not just giving something up, but it's giving something over to something bigger. It's making something holy. So you give something up for a greater purpose. So it might be interesting to talk with the kids about what are sacrifices that they've made or that their family may have made for the sake of something bigger. Now, there's a lot of scholarship written on why animal sacrifice. Most cultures have a history of animal sacrifice. Judaism, the ancient Israelites, had a whole system of animal sacrifice. The whole temple was built around the altar upon which you made sacrifices. And we might think, oh, that's so archaic, it's so barbaric and horrible, the slaughtering of animals, how terrible. But the interesting thing is that most of us eat meat. Most of the kids eat meat. And what's interesting is you go to a nice restaurant, you have a steak, and you don't know where it came from. You don't have a relationship with that cow. That cow was slaughtered somewhere far away from us. Parents might buy meat in a supermarket, and we have no relationship to where that meat comes from. In fact, we call it meat instead of calling it animal or flesh. So what's interesting about sacrifice is, as barbaric as it seems to us, the idea of holding a goat down and the priest cutting its neck, it's actually, in what the rabbis say, what scholars say is that deep down we have a sense that eating meat is wrong. That we feel bad that something has to die for us to sustain ourselves because of our cravings or our need for nourishment. Deep down we feel bad about that. And sacrifice is man's way of inviting God to the table. So if we offer a little bit of the meat to God, we've essentially invited God to our table, and therefore it makes it somewhat okay. So what are the ways that we might invite God to our table today? What are the ways that when you have a meal, how do the kids, maybe some of them keep kosher, maybe they don't, but what do they think about? Are they allowed to eat sugar all day? Why don't they eat junk food? What is the Jewish principle behind treating our bodies well? Our body is a vehicle for doing mitzvot. So the discussion of sacrifice is really a discussion of how we express gratitude for the things that we have, and also about our consumption of meat in a way. So one of the interesting things in this week's Torah portion is that the very first word of the Torah portion, the first word of the book of Leviticus, VaYikra, means, and God called to Moses, and the aleph, the last letter of that word, is always written smaller. It's always really tiny in any Torah around the world. So why is it so tiny? The rabbis suggest that it's because Moses himself was so humble that the calling came from a very small place. The aleph is silent. The aleph is the first letter of the word ani, which means I, which is the ego. It's that quiet place. Sometimes we think a calling is like a big, strong command, but sometimes maybe it really comes from that humble place where we acknowledge that we're small and that God is so big, and we're open to receiving God. The word Kabbalah in Judaism, in Hebrew, means to receive, that openness to receive. So, however, you might talk to the kids about when is it good to be humble and small and appreciative and quiet and listening, and when is it good to stand up and be big and use your voice. There are times when it's important to do that, and to remain small and quiet would be the wrong thing to do. So the rabbis say that we have two notes in each of our pockets. One pocket has the note that says we are little less than angels, meaning we're like almost godlike. And the other note says, I am but dust and ashes. I am nothing. And so sometimes when we are too full of ourselves, we have to take out the note that reminds us that we are nothing. And sometimes when we are feeling really down on ourselves, we have to remind ourselves that we're here, that if you need proof that you have a purpose in the world, the proof is the fact that you were born. God created you, and that's the proof that God wanted you here. So there are also some interesting things about sacrifice, that it's not about sacrificing the animal and giving. God doesn't need the blood of goats. God doesn't need to be fed. It's rather the animal in us that we're trying to tame. We're trying to give over our animal nature so that we can be more humane. There's a little bit of talk about people who are poor. People who are poor might not be able to afford to give up their goat to make a sacrifice, or an ox, or a lamb. And so instead they might bring a bird. And the rabbis point out that if you burn a bird on the altar, the feathers actually make a horrible smell. And so the Torah says that you should leave the feathers on. And the rabbis say the reason is because if you pluck all the feathers off of a bird, it's going to look so pathetic. And it's going to be humiliating for the poor person. So at least leave its finery on its body so that the poor person might not be shamed. And it goes on to say that if you can't even afford a bird, you might just offer like a handful of flour, a meal offering. And even that is as sweet a savoring to God as if you had offered a whole barbecued ox. Because it's not really about the smell of the meat. It's really about the perfume of the mitzvah that you are doing. The last part of our section talks about midot. The midah is gratitude, and it's interesting because there's this phrase gam zula tova, which you'll find on page 69, which means this is also for the good. And that's considered a very holy place to be. If you can say, no matter what happens to you, this is also for the good, even when there are bad things, then you're at a very elevated level. So that might be an interesting thing for the kids. Can you think of something bad that happened that over time you realize was also for the good? Can you interpret bad things for the good? And how do we do that? That's a really hard thing to do. So enjoy your teaching, and thank you.